that. Okay, so I think I'm recording now to both the Torah class, Torah study for Bereans on Facebook, as well as our Tree of Life on Facebook, and we're recording here on the computer. So hopefully we'll get all this straightened out. We're ready to go. And I think we've got just about everybody lined up. It's 7:01, so let's go ahead and get started, and then everyone else can, I guess they'll jump in when they get here. And I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. You know the rules that when you want to say something, just unmute yourself. And if I don't like what you're saying, I'll mute you back. All right. Okay. Okay, so let me go ahead and welcome everyone here tonight to another installment of our Tree of Life Torah and Bible study classes that we've got going on. Tonight we'll be hitting the 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and let's begin with a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in words of Torah. Now, I have to admit tonight that this is one of the most difficult to try to figure out what it is they're saying, because everything that I've read, and I got a new commentary that I'm excited about. Okay, and I just got this new commentary right here, and it is and actually I got the companion to it for the Old Testament, but Craig Keener is quite a scholar, and I used his book, his set of books. It's 4 of them. When I did the class on Acts. And so he put this commentary together, a verse by verse commentary on customs and just, the everyday things that go on. And I was reading, the part in the Old Testament where Jacob and Jacob's ladder and all that. I looked up, okay, how many days does it take to walk from Beersheba up to Luz or Bethel nowadays? And how they do that? I looked on there, opened it up, and it says it's a 2-day walk from Beersheba up to Luz, where Jacob had his vision, his dream of the ladder. So I think it's going to be very very helpful to me. And plus, I'm just nerdy like that. I like background noise when it comes to history and and customs and so forth. So anyway, I've been reading that, and it gave me some insight into these verses, but it didn't give me everything. So there's some things that depending on how many you talk about, 2 Jews and 3 opinions, well, you get a couple of theologians or commentators, and you got a plethora of opinions as to what various things mean. So, Carmen, you got your hand raised.
What's his name again?
Craig S. Kenner.
Okay.
Craig S. Kenner, Kenner.
Okay.
All right. And
thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, they're if you get it on Amazon, I think it's normally $40-something, and I got it for like 21 or 22. So it was on sale or clearance. I don't know. But anyway, I got it. And it's like 2 inches thick, so it's quite a bargain if you can't use it for that. It's great doorstop. Okay, so tonight we're going to be looking at a real puzzling passage, and before we get into it, we have to unravel a few cultural practices at the time. So the congregation in Corinth was basically, it was just a microcosm of the community in Corinth at large, so it just mirrored what was out there in Corinth. Corinth was diverse in culture, background, education, and wealth, and there were slaves and freedmen and so forth. And this congregation in Corinth reflected all of those. They had all of those various segments of society within their congregation. And so because of that, you're going to have different customs, different languages, prior religions. Where did they come from? What was their journey like? And even differences in fashion. One group wore cowboy boots and the other group wore wingtips. There's something like that. And so all of those things fit into what we're going to be studying tonight in chapter 11. Now we're going to start at verse 2 because verse 1 actually was in last week's lesson, where Paul said, "Be like me, because I'm like Yeshua." All right. So anyway, let's go into it. Are there any questions from last week? I know we had a good discussion afterwards, but any other comments or questions that might have popped up? Okay, well then let's go ahead with the verses. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firm the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Messiah, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Messiah is God. All right, so that to me is very disjointed. It doesn't flow well. And so what traditions is Paul talking? What traditions is Paul? What does he mean there when he says, "I remember everything and hold that you, because you remember me and everything and hold firm the traditions that I passed on to you"? Well, the traditions are the oral instructions that Paul and others, Apollos was one of them, and they had other teachers there that taught them during the foundation of the congregation, and also since the foundation. And he compliments them that they're still following the precepts and the instructions that he had handed down. And he did that before he jumped into another subject then, which was the proper conduct in worship, or the proper conduct of worship that he had. So and he does that a good bit. It's typical of the writing of the day, where you would compliment people before you nail them. And so that's kind of what he did here. Now verse 3 there, where it says, "But I want you to know that the head of every man is Messiah, the head of the woman is a man, and the head of the Messiah is God." Okay, that is a play on words, okay, because what he's doing there, using head literally as the what I said in the notes, the brain housing group, or your cranium, your skull. And it also, it's been interpreted that, okay, he's saying that this is a chain of command, an authoritarian thing, that, okay, the head of every person, of every man is Messiah. Okay, your boss is the Messiah. And then, oh yeah, well, your wife, you're her boss, but the head of the Messiah, everybody's boss, is God. Is kind of that's what some of the interpretations are. Other ones, they, instead of using the chain of command or authority there, they say that it could mean source. That's a little bit, I mean, and you'd have to read it a little bit differently there, that know that the source of every man or every believer, I guess in this case, is the Messiah. How do you get to where you are? It's through the Messiah. And the source of the woman is the man. Meaning going back to Adam is where he's coming from on that. And the source of Messiah is from God. It's a little bit different, different way of looking at that, but he does do that. It's kind of a chain, a play on words, but then it becomes he goes right from there into the next verses, which again, how does he get from the head of the head of every man is Messiah, the head of every woman is the man, and the head of Messiah is God, and then every man praying, going into the next next verse, is every man praying or prophesying with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman praying or prophesying with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For it is one and the same as having been shaved. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, let her cut her hair off, or let her cut off her hair. But it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved. Let her cover her head. Okay, so what is Paul saying there? It is confusing, and there are different ideas. Okay, covering of the head. In some of the commentators has said, well, that's disrespectful to God when you cover your head. They don't really explain why it would be disrespectful to God to cover your head, because certainly nowadays in the Jewish community, we cover our heads, where we wear a kippah, yarmulke, when we pray, and the priests certainly had their heads covered when they were praying. So it doesn't make that particular idea of covering the head dishonoring, that it dishonors his head. That one to me doesn't work very well. There's another idea that with the Romans covered their heads while they were praying to idols. What they would do, I've been told, is that as they would pray, they wore these togas, and the kind of a wraparound thing, and so they would take one end of the toga and then sling it over their head and cover their head as they were making their prayers to the idol, the pagan god that they were petitioning. And so that makes a little bit more sense then why Paul would say, don't cover your head. And then there's a third one that I read that in trying to explain this, that the male temple prostitutes of that day, and that in Corinth, they would wear a veil over their head so as not to be recognized in society. So when they were out doing their prostitution stuff, they would wear a veil or a covering over their head, so that then later on, after they had done that, they could go back out on the street and no one would know who they were. And so there is something to be said for that. Now, but at the same time, if a guy was a temple prostitute, then what's he doing in the congregation, in the body of Messiah, and praying? That just doesn't make any sense. So to me, the second option there, where the Romans covered their heads, so don't be like the Romans when they're praying to the pagans. Okay, so but now that he gets the other, is for a woman does not cover her head, let her cut off her hair, but it is shameful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, let her cover her head. All right, so what he's saying here, typical Pauline language here, where he just wraps it around and around. that when she's praying with her head uncovered, she is being dishonorable or shameful. Why? Because in that day, they had several factions within the congregation. You had the Greek, well, maybe three major factions. You had the Romans, you had the Greeks, and you had the Eastern, that would be the people from the Middle East, the Turks, the people from Asia Minor, and the Israelites, the Jews, and their custom was to wear some kind of a covering over the head. In fact, some of the sects or religions over there, their women would wear a veil, and it went from nose to toes. It was just and what we see a lot of that today, it's called a burqa, and they put that the thing on over their head, and all you can see is the eye slits. And so that was maybe part of the custom of the Jewish faction within the body of in the congregation there in Corinth. And yet the Greeks, their women generally had some kind of a head covering, and so they were used to the head covering. But then the Roman women, not so much. That was getting further and further away from these old traditions that they had. The Roman women, they had, instead of veils and that sort of stuff, well, they had fancy hairdos. Okay, and so that was kind of their traditions that they did, and so as a result, you had differences of opinion as to what was proper in worship and just being in public and so forth. So Paul actually was coming from the standpoint of being that Eastern Mediterranean, Middle Eastern mindset. He was a Jew's Jew. Okay, so that's kind of where he's coming from in there. And so but basically what he's saying is that if it's shameful for a woman to uncover her head, then let her cut her hair off. And if it's shameful for her to cut her head off, well, then cover her head up. So he's just kind of throwing it right back. It's a rhetorical mechanism that he's using there. But basically his idea is that a woman should probably have her head covered when she's praying and or worshiping or prophesying, whatever it is that she's doing. Now, they certainly did not restrict women from participation in the worship, and that was kind of breaking away a lot from the customs of the day, because certainly in Greek custom, the women stayed home. When a man went to a banquet someplace, it was a man going to a banquet. He did not bring his wife with him. But that was starting to change a little bit. More and more that was changing. And you would see once in a while, Greek men would allow their wives to come with them to the banquets. And the Romans had no problem with the wives coming along. So you see these different cultures. And the Jewish side of it was that was much more family oriented. That when you got together with other people, you came as a family unit, your husband and wife. So you had the varying degrees of the different customs within the congregation of Corinth. And so Paul is trying to somehow meld all of these together and sort them out as to what would be proper conduct. And I think that we'll cap it here in just a second as we read this next part of it. It says, for surely a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man is neither from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Okay? All right. Now, Paul is in no way denigrating women here. Okay, so a lot of people think that Paul was just a terrible misogynist, and no, he was not. He was much more egalitarian, but he also was mindful of the customs of the day, and so he harks back then to creation. Basically, is where he's going back to that, where he says that. Man was the image and glory of God, because the Bible says that God said, let us create man in our image. And then the woman came from the man. Okay, so God took a bone from the man, and from that bone formed the woman. And so there's and it said, for man is not from woman, but woman from man. Of course, that's the creation story. And it says, but here's the thing. Paul is saying, now neither was man created for the woman's sake, but for the man's sake. Basically, what he's saying there, and if you go back to the Hebrew of that the idea that God made woman what the old English word for it was a helpmeet. And some have said it's a helpmate. Okay. But basically what that was is God created the woman to complement the man. A woman has many strengths that a man does not have. A man has strengths that a woman doesn't have. They complement each other in the marriage, so that the two individuals, now when they are together, they are complete, they are whole, a couple. And that's what God intended, for a man and a woman to come together and be a couple, and to complement each other, and to understand that each one has a different role in the relationship, in the coupling, as it were, in that partnership. And that's what Paul is saying, that neither was the man created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake. They were put there together for a purpose, and for basically it's kind of like a puzzle coming together. And then once you've got that together, or like I like to say, maybe a joint, if you're making wood furniture or something, where you've got a locking joint. I love to make things that dovetails, for one thing, in furniture, and other types of sliding locking joints, so that once you put them together, they are stronger than the board would be by itself. And so that's what God did with the woman. Now, verse 10 there, it says, for this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, the veil, whatever, because of the angels. Okay, I'll admit, I don't have a clue what he's talking about here. None whatsoever. Some people say, well, it's because back in the day, they talk about the angels coming down and mating with the women, and then there were giants. And so, some people really get wound up in that, and they just think that's speaking of talking about the Nephilim. And so, but there weren't a whole lot of Nephilim right there in the time frame that Paul was talking about. The other things that he could have been also talking about there was that, in the millennial era, it says we will even be judging the angels. Now, it's not going to be judging the angels that did not fall per se, but we would be judging the fallen angels. And so for that reason, a woman ought to understand the the authority command structure, and because she is going to be part of that command structure and that judging and so forth in the millennial area, pointing to the end of days, that a woman would be in that group of people, that she was not going to be sidelined someplace because, okay, no women can be judges. Well, that's not God's way. We've had women, we talk about Deborah all the time, about how God put her in a place that even the king wouldn't go to battle, go to war without her with him. And so God uses women, and so that would be a reason why, when he says that, because of the angels. And other people said, well, it's because the angels are always looking over us, and that you don't want the woman to be immodest. If they're always looking over us, then they're going to see us in all sorts of states of immodesty and so forth, and even the president looks funny sometimes. All right. So, and that's any president. That was not a political statement. Okay. All right. Any comments or questions so far on that? Did I confuse everybody?
Yes. Okay, you disappeared. No, I'm just asking, did you mention that about and I could have been reading instead of listening, that they shaved their heads for the pagan custom. And that's why Paul said, cover your hair, that's shameful, because they used to dedicated their locks as a token of worship to and a vow to a little g god. And so that's why they had shaved heads.
That could have been another reason that they would do that, that they would shy away from that the idea. But for the pagan women, cutting their hair off for the purpose of making an offering of it was not shameful to them at all. It was an act of contrition. It was an act of adoration. It was an act of worship. So,
but it was to a god,
sure,
not
it was to a little g god. Okay,
right?
A false, an idol. And so,
yes.
for them, it would not have been shameful. But
right.
For the believing community, the body of Messiah there in Corinth, they could have looked at that and said, "Ooh, that's what the pagans do." That's a good point. That's what the pagans do, and so we don't want to do that. Okay, so I think that's a good point that I had read that, and then I forgot to put it in there. Okay, good point. So it's a good thing you were reading and not listening. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions before we go on? Okay. Now, so we go. If we go here in 1 Corinthians 11-16. But in any case, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, and woman is not independent, and man is not independent of woman. Going back to that same thing that we talked about before. For just as the woman came from the man, so also the man comes through the woman. But all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Doesn't the natural order of things teach you, if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it's her glory, for her hair was given to her as a covering. But if anyone intends to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do God's communities. All right. So Paul is saying here that, okay, men and women are equal. We need each other. Each one of us have different sets of abilities and capabilities, strengths, and so forth. And so he's just restating that in another way. And then verses 13 and 14, he says, don't we even see this from nature? Well, okay, it's not obvious to me what he's getting there on the the nature. And then when I read the various commentators, just about every one of them that I read had a different take on what that means by being from nature. That because to me, if you were going to be looking at nature, then you'd see, okay, who's the prettiest birds? Well, it sure is not the female bird, it's the male bird. And so in man, which one's the prettiest bird? Well, it's sure not the man, it's the woman that's the prettiest one. And that hair is her glory. And but it also talks about how that a man is not going to have long hair. I mean, if he does, it is a shame. It's a shameful thing. So there were people throughout history that had long hair. Absalom was one. Okay, he was so proud of his long, flowy, curly locks, and the all the gals, that for some reason they just thought that was great. They loved to run their fingers through his hair. And if you're old enough to know Brill Cream, you know what I just sang. All right, so that was other than a Nazirite vow. Samson was not to cut his hair. That was a special exception. John the Baptist, Yochanan the Immerser, did not cut his hair because he was a Nazirite from birth, as was Samson. Other people would take a Nazirite vow for up to a year. And normally a Nazirite vow was a minimum of 30 days and up to a year. And during that time, you wouldn't cut your hair. But then at the end of it, you cut your hair. So this also tells us that, guess what? Yeshua had short hair. He would have had hair just like all the other Jewish men of the day, and he would not have had a beard that looked like some grizzly woolly mammoth. No, he would have had whatever beard a 30-year-old guy could grow. Some 30-year-old guys can't grow a beard. I was one. It took me until I was at least 103 before I could grow a beard. And but Yeshua had short hair and the beard that went with it. And some people even say that, beards were really not that much in fashion. We do know that Yeshua had a beard because they plucked it out at his trial and then crucifixion. But he would have had short hair. And for that, Paul would have had short hair. All the disciples would have had short hair. Why? Because long hair on a man was not acceptable in society. It was shameful. Okay, so let's any comments on that? I mean, it's just yeah, Gudrun.
Obviously, are you there?
Yes.
Oh, good. I kind of lost my video here. Obviously, I don't know, and I don't know the details, but I mean, at that point in time, it's not like where people would go to the barber once a month. From that standpoint, it seems to me, they might sometimes have too much facial hair or too much head hair because we don't go to the barber once a month.
Well, that is true, but in general, these the pictures that you see with the European Jesus, with his hair down to his shoulders, no, it would have he would have had his hair cut at certain times, and they actually had scissors back then, bronze scissors. They weren't all that particularly sharp, but they would have gotten their hair cut on a periodic basis, maybe only 2 or 3 times a year. And I'm one of those kind of guys that I just hate to take the time to get a haircut, and so I'll go 2 months at a time without a haircut. And I have been overseas where I was just not even possible because of requirements that I was, just it was not possible to get a haircut. And I hated it. When my hair got to be that long, all, and the back and everything, I hated that. And so they would figure out a way of trimming that hair and the beard. But, the idea of what we consider, the Jewish guy now with the big fluffy beard and the peyote, that is more of a modern interpretation. I say modern, within the last few hundred years, not at the time that Yeshua was living. But he would have somehow got his hair cut, and obviously you're not going to go to the barber shop once a month, but they would have had some kind of a time frame there where you notice that when they were torturing him and beating him and so forth at the crucifixion,
Right, yeah.
they didn't pull the hair out of his head. They plucked his beard, because that's what he had. He had more beard than he had hair. That's kind of a speculation on my part, but I think it's probably correct.
No, that makes sense. I wasn't questioning that. It was just my thought was that we saw him so often with the long hair and the long beard was more or less because of the circumstances at the time, and he wasn't capable of,
No, actually, they did have the capability of cutting hair, and that was the style. If you look at statues of the Romans during that period of time, their hair was only an inch or two long. It was not long. And the idea of long hair was more a thing of the barbarians, the Germanic, the Teutons and so forth. So yeah, they had the capability, and it was customary to have your hair, what is short. I mean, they didn't get a number two buzz cut, but it could have been, it could have been, they didn't look like they were coming right out of boot camp. But they would have had shorter relatively short hair, not flowing down to their shoulders. That's for sure.
That's a good
Okay.
explanation. I appreciate that.
Okay, Carmen, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that because also, like, even I know they didn't have barber shops, but like today, I cut my husband's hair. I mean, your family would have cut it. Your mother or your sisters or somebody.
My wife has been cutting my hair for almost 50 years.
Yeah.
And nobody can do it as good as she can. So anyhow, okay, Carl, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, we're talking about Nazarite vows. You read in Acts 18:18 that Paul took a vow. I assume that was a Nazarite vow, and I'm under the impression, well, he did it so that he wouldn't get stoned by the Jews that were there. He's showing that I'm still following the Mosaic law, but he had no way of ending it. You can take a Nazarite vow rather easily. We could do that today. The problem is we can't end it because you need an animal sacrifice to end it. And so the way I understand it, that's one of the reasons he wanted to get back to Jerusalem by the Feast of Weeks. Whether he did or succeeded or not, we don't know, but he did get back. And as soon as he did, the disciples said, well, you go to the temple now and do this animal sacrifice and take these 4 people with you in Acts 21. So I'm thinking that it was probably more like 2 years that he was stuck with this thing and probably got very upset with his hair being so long at that time.
It could very well have been, and it might not even have been a Nazarite vow. It could have been just any kind of a vow. These other guys had the Nazarite vow, and he says, go along with them and pay for their sacrifices because they were not wealthy. Paul had funds from somehow or another. People said that Paul was pretty much independently wealthy, or at least he had an income stream of some sort. So that's one.
Well, he
one
did
of the
have his hair. He did say, they do say in Acts 21 that he had his head shaved. So it sounds like and his vow was almost complete. The week was almost over. So anyway, you're right.
It makes sense that it would be a Nazarite vow. It makes sense. It sure does. Okay. All right, good comments. Anything else? All right, so let's go ahead. But in giving you this instruction, I do not praise you, for when you meet together, it does more harm than good. For first of all, when you come together as Messiah's community, I hear there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. Okay, Paul gets right down to his argument here, and he says basically, when you guys get together, it's just not good. It's worse than if you don't get together. And so the meetings are contentious. They're embarrassing. It doesn't reflect the love of Yeshua. Okay. And so Paul is I think he's being a little sarcastic here. It says, and I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. It's like, oh, I just can't believe that there would be dissension among all of you people. It's kind of hard to get that one way or the other, how that comes out in the Greek. But it's and others say that Paul is actually being gracious here and says, I hear there's some divisions, and to some extent I can believe that, yeah, there probably is, based on just culture and people. And so some people are giving Paul the benefit of the doubt. Me, I kind of prefer the Paul with the whooping stick there. He's going after him. So said for verse 19, for there must be factions among you, so that those among you who are tried and true may be evident. Okay, what does this sound like to you? Does this sound like something that Paul is saying, that, oh yeah, you got to have factions in your congregation, because otherwise, how do you know who's right and who's wrong? No, I think what this is that this is another one of those memes that come out of the Corinthian congregation, like that, the one about, well, I'm free in Messiah. I can do all things in Messiah. And so now he's saying, oh, well, there's got to be some factions here, because how else would we know those of us that are correct and those of us who are not? And those of you that are on a telephone instead of on a camera don't see me working on my collar and fluffing up my little collar and looking all prim and proper, and being that kind of guy. And that's kind of, I think that's where Paul is coming with there. He's saying that you guys are saying you got to have factions, so that the ones who are on top and the ones who are correct can know that everybody else knows that you're the correct ones. Nah, that's not what I don't think. And so I think he's, again, being sarcastic and kind of throwing it back at them. And I do say that this verse is very, it's obscure. It's not 100%, but that's kind of what I got out of it. And so there are many other commentators that kind of look at that too, and then there's other ones that just scratch their head and said, "No, we really don't know what he's talking about here." So therefore, when you meet together in the same place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For each one takes his own supper beforehand, and one goes hungry while another gets drunk. What? It is certainly not that you do not have houses, is it? Don't you have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise God's community and try to humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? I do not praise you for this. All right. So Paul is, he's definitely got that wooden spatula out now, and he's beating them with it, because he says, when you guys get together, it's not for communion. It's not for the benefit of the community. It's not so that it's a good, one of the things that I praise God, I thank God for in Tree of Life Messianic Congregation, that when we get together, I truly believe it's for the betterment of everyone that is there, because we enjoy each other's company. Okay. Now, some of you, maybe, you know, there are those here in the class that are not part of that congregation. But when you get together with your congregations, is it not to get to actually have a good time being with people who are like-minded and worship Yeshua like you do? That's what it should be. But what Paul is saying here is, no, that's not what you're doing, guys. You're getting together, all you rich hoi polloi, in the, you know, your fine clothes, and you get together. You guys get there early because you don't have to work for a living. So you get there at where the meeting is early, and you get shown the nice places, and then you start eating, and then you are all full and you're drunk because you have drunk a lot of wine, and then you're you know, that's not, you know, it's contentious, because then when the poorer people come in, maybe they haven't eaten all day, they haven't had a chance to eat, so they're hungry and you've already eaten. And so basically these guys are turning their excuse for getting together for the Lord's Supper, as it were, they're turning that into a festive feast, like the pagan festival feast, you know, where it's just a lot of the Greeks were really good at this, you know, the who was, and I can't remember if Bacchus was Greek or Roman, but the god of wine, and they could, you know, they get together and party down. And so that's basically what these guys were doing too. And so Paul is, you know, the very idea that you get together as a body of Messiah and you get drunk. And Paul is just apoplectic over that. You know, he just is, he's almost without words, but Paul is never without words. So, you know, he's, you know, what he does, verse 22, he says, what? You know, and I can just hear, you know, the paper, he probably wrote it out in all caps and bold, underlined, and then exclamation points after if they have that in Greek. I don't know that they do, but he's telling them, don't you have your home so that you can eat at home? You get together for the Lord's Supper, for the communion, with one purpose in mind. You get together in unity, in harmony, and you have a spirit of love and respect for people, not this spirit of you know, the wealth, or the wealthy are there, and you know, and singing the song, I'm in the money, you know, that sort of thing. No, that's not how you're supposed to do that, and that's what Paul is after them for. So comments or questions, you know, don't ask, don't wait for me to ask. If you got something to say, jump in there, and hopefully I'll see you. Okay, now what I thought about was, okay, what does the typical Greek home look like? Now, these congregations would have been meeting in the homes of the more affluent people in the congregation, okay? The ones that had the big houses, they would be the ones that would be hosting. You know, because, you know, you're not going to have a congregation of 50 people in a 1-bedroom efficiency studio apartment that where your kitchen and living room and bedroom are all the same room. You know, it just, you can't do that. So it would have been up to the wealthy among the community to have the service and have the meeting at their home. Now, this is what would be more of a typical mid to upper class Greek home. Okay, now they were not terribly extravagant, the Greeks weren't, but you know, they down here. Now, I don't know if you can see my my cursor here, but I don't know, because somebody had said yesterday when I was teaching using another format that they couldn't see my cursor. Can you see my cursor down there on on the picture? Somebody
I
tell
can,
me.
I can see
Yes,
it,
I
but,
can see
but
it.
you know, you can make it larger. You can make your hand larger
I can
on
make my hand. Oh, okay. Well, I'll figure
your
out how to do
cursor
that
larger later on. Yeah.
another day. Okay.
Oh.
So you see all these guys down here in the andron. All right. That is the fancy eating place. And that's where you would get together with all the wealthy patrons of the congregation. You know, this is the deacon board gets together there, and maybe the worship leader, and oh yeah, the pianist and the organist for sure get to go to that. And so, you know, this, and oh, the guy that maybe he doesn't want to be a deacon, but you know, he's the one with the deep pockets, or he owns the house, of course. And so they invite all of those people to the andron, and they'll probably get there a little early, and so that they get all of the fancy hors d'oeuvres and appetizers and all of that before the working class people get there. And you know, okay, so I'm sounding a little bit sarcastic there, but that's what Paul is talking about. That is what they were actually doing. And so they were getting together here. Now, any spillover when the unwashed working people get there, maybe the people who are believers, but they're also slaves, and they get a little time off from their boss, from their master, to go to one of these things. And so where do they end up? Well, they end up out here in the courtyard, okay? And which is not really, I mean, it's just, you know, it's not like being in here where you got the soft couches and stuff, and the better food. In fact, probably not going to be any food out there. You bring you brown bag it if you're going to go to one of those things, because you know that you're not going to be invited in there to the fanciest part of it. And that's what Paul is really ripping on these guys about, is for setting up that kind of a environment for their meetings. Okay, now each a Greek home would have this courtyard, because in there they're showing a well here, and that well enough, but they would also, the Greeks would have had an altar out there, because when they prayed or made sacrifices, they did it in the open so that their prayers would go unimpeded to their God, whoever that was. And so the Greeks did their praying actually out in their courtyard in the open air. That was just their custom. All right. And so here's another picture, perhaps, of the typical Greek home of the day. You know, they would have, but they might have different layouts, of course, different floor plans and so forth, depending on how they were, you know, the wealth of the family and so forth. But they generally had a courtyard of some sort that would serve as a as a overflow room for the rest of the congregation that couldn't make it in or weren't invited into the fancy part. All right, so let's go on ahead. And this is a part here now where we know this. We've seen that, we read this, you know, whenever we have communion, this is what I read. For I've received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Yeshua, on the night he was betrayed, took matzah, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in memory of me." In the same way, also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in memory of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Okay, now there's a lot here. We could spend a couple of hours just on this part, but this is, you know, I don't have time for that tonight. Paul received the order. We don't know how he received it. He said, "That which I received." Maybe he got it from the other disciples. They talked to him about the communion, or he might have got it straight from Yeshua himself, because remember, Paul spent spent 3 years out in the Arabian desert from the time of his Damascus Road experience till when he went really out and started proclaiming the gospel seriously. He did it immediately, but with measured success. But then after 3 years, he had gotten his theology down. He had gone back and researched all the scriptures, and now he was sure, because he knew the scriptures and how it pointed to the Messiah. And so now here he was in this situation. So we don't know if it was the Lord that sent it, in a vision, or if it was the disciples. Immaterial. But he says that on the night that he was betrayed, took the matzah. Okay, and here's a rabbi trail. Okay, he took bread. Okay, I don't believe that it was matzah, the unleavened bread at that point, because it was not the Passover meal at that point. It would have been a pre-Passover meal. It was a fellowship meal, because the Passover came after the lamb was slain, after the lamb was slaughtered and roasted, and then they would have the meal that evening. And so he did this the evening before. And so there's a lot of people said, well, he could have still been having the Passover a day ahead of time. And, fair enough. He could very well have done that, because he knew he couldn't do it the night before. Anyway, he took bread. When he'd given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Okay, this, the idea of taking the bread and the wine, it's covenant language. Okay, and so you would, in a covenant, what you did was you took the animals and you split them, you broke them in half, and that was part of the covenant. And so he's taking the bread and breaking. This is his body. You break that, like in a covenant. You split the carcass on either side. You walk down the middle of the carcasses of the dead animals on either side of you. And that's part of a covenant back in those days, the Old Testament covenant. And so that's the language that he's talking about there. It's covenant language of the bread being the body, the carcasses, and the wine, the blood. Wine was a part of a covenant back in those days. All right. And so here it says this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Okay. And so it's not the blood of goats and bulls that saves people anymore, or justifies them. It's the blood of Yeshua. And he says, so do this as often as you drink it. Now, it says as often. Okay. How is as often? There is no frequency. There's nothing that says, okay, you need to do this on a monthly basis. The way I grew up, the first Sunday of every month, that was Communion Sunday. You could just take it to the bank. And then there are Messianic congregations that the only time that they have the Lord's Supper, Yeshua's table, is at Passover. Only time that they even mention it or do it. I've attended other Messianic congregations where at the end of every service, they have a communion, and they have the bread and the wine, and they recite this scripture right here. It doesn't matter. It just says, however often as you do it, do this in remembrance or in memory of Yeshua. Okay. It doesn't matter. Just remember what you're there for. And so he says, when you do this, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Okay. And here again, we're looking toward, has an eschatological viewpoint. We're looking toward the end of the age and the beginning of the Messianic age when the Lord comes back. All right. Comments, questions? Okay, so therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the Lord's cup in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But a man must examine himself, and let him eat of the bread and drink from the cup. For the one who eats and drinks without recognizing the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. For this reason, many among you are weak and sick, and quite a few have died. All right, so this is kind of a tough one here, where Paul is saying, okay, now if you eat this, eat the bread and drink the cup unworthily, what does that mean? In an unworthy manner. All right, a lot of people says, well, if you got sin in your life, certainly, if you've got sin in your life, you don't want to be taking the emblems and getting yourself into that sacrament, because it's pretty obvious you don't do that when you are when you're just a blatant sinner. I'm not talking about the person who is all of us, are we going to be totally sin-free and guilt-free and all that when every time we take communion? Probably not. There's going to be something, but it's God's grace covers that. What he's talking about here is if you're going into that with a lifestyle of sin or a lifestyle of abusing the rest of the congregation because you're wealthy and they're not, and that you always have to be the one who is up front and doing this and that and the other, and the other people that you look down on them because maybe they have they're not on there as far on the journey as you perceive yourself to have been, and they struggle with things. I see it all the time with people, talking with people, not only in our congregation, but just I get phone calls and people talk to me. You said, would you pray for me? Pray with me, help me. I've got this, I need somebody to talk to me. And basically, they don't want somebody to talk to them. They want to be able to talk to somebody. And so I become a listener, and then we pray with them. But that's a lot of people kind of look down on that, like the Pharisees says, I thank God that I'm not like these dirty old, scummy old sinners out there. God's, don't be that guy. Don't be that guy. And if you are that guy, then you're eating and drinking unworthily. You can be the biggest, fanciest preacher or the deacon or the worship leader and so forth, and miss the mark because of your attitude toward your fellow man. He said, but examine yourself. See if you just say, hey, Lord, am I that guy? Surely, if I am, show me. David said that, search my heart and see if there's any wicked way in me. And that's what we need to do. So it says, for anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body what? The body of Messiah, also the body of the congregation, the people there, Yeshua's body, that certainly that was sacrificed, but the body that are there, your congregation. And when you eat and drink without recognizing them and their faults, their failures, their goodness, their high points, and so forth, you're eating and drinking judgment to yourself. It says, so many of you are sick, and I never turned my page over there. Many of you are sick and weak, and quite a few have died. So what I think Paul is saying is, because of this attitude, perhaps God is withholding some healing and withholding blessings from you. And so beware of that you need to make sure that you are charitable to everyone. So it says, for if we're judging ourselves thoroughly, we wouldn't be coming under judgment. Know yourself. And it says, but when we are judged, we are being disciplined by the Lord, so we might not be condemned along with the world. Okay, there was Jewish thought at the time. It was just Jewish custom, Jewish thought, that the righteous are judged in this world by God, for their few sins, because if they're righteous, they only have a few sins, but they're judged for it. And the unrighteous then will be judged in the world to come by God for their many sins, because they are unrighteous. And so sometimes God would send suffering along to help you remember that you need to keep your eyes on the prize, as it were. And that was just kind of Jewish thought and teaching at the time. And so, that would have been something that Paul would have been familiar with, and maybe it's reflected in what he's saying there. So basically he says, so when you get together, wait for one another. In other words, you rich guys don't get in there and get all the goodies. You wait and let and shoot, we've all been to buffets before, where you get there and somebody has gone through and they've taken all the smoked salmon. I mean, every bit of it, and so there's none of it left. And so, or whatever. And so what do you get stuck with? Well, you get stuck with even the rubber chicken is gone. Oh no. Okay. Well, and so it says just wait on each other. And it's a good thing. One of the things that was instilled in me many years ago is you take care of your people first before you eat. And all throughout my military career, I made sure that my men ate as well as I did. And they would, when I was a ship captain, we made sure that their galley was just like our galley. We ate the same food. I would go up there and inspect that galley, making sure that those guys, their food was just as good as what I had back there in the wardroom. And so, and I think that's what Paul is saying here. Whatever you do, however you worship, going back to the head covering and so forth. And it's not hard and fast. It's not etched in concrete. But whatever you do, however you worship the Lord, do it in the best way that you know, so that you're bringing glory to God. When you get together with the congregation, everything that you should do should be for the glory of God and for the upbuilding and the edification of everyone in the congregation, so that you're building them up and just helping them along. And it's not for your own self-aggrandizement. I've seen way too many times where preachers will get up there and they'll come in from off stage, they'll sweep in with their entourage, and they'll get there and a guy comes up behind them and takes the cloak off of him. I've actually seen this. And the music is going with the Star Wars theme was nothing compared to that kind of scenery, or the praise and worship leader. I've tried to work with praise and worship leaders before, and this one guy told me, he says, "Oh, you don't understand. It doesn't matter if they can, because I tell them, you got to bring people into worship. You don't." I said, well, the way that you're doing that, I said, we can't follow. We don't know where you're going. How can you worship if you don't know what's going on? He says, it doesn't matter. I'm an artist. And he told me, he says, I'm an artist. I don't care about that. He said, they can worship with, along with what I do, because I'm an artist. And so he never did get it. And so you see that what Paul is saying, he says, don't be that guy. Don't be the artist. Be the worship guy. Be the one that can bring people to worship. Be the one that lifts people up and leaves them in a better place when the meeting is over and they all go home. All right, that is that was, well, wow, I went way over. I'm sorry, but anyway, that's I try to keep it to 1 hour, but we went over. It's okay. Any comments or questions?
Well, I did want to say on that discipline, when God disciplines you, didn't Jacob have his hip out of whack? And Paul was it Paul that had the thorn in his side to keep him, one of those two, to keep them
Well-
from getting a big head, so to speak? Or,
Paul said that he had a thorn in the side. He had prayed that God would remove it many times, and God said, "My grace is sufficient for you." That's all you need to know. The one with Jacob and the hip, yeah, it may have been a reminder to Jacob that of the time that he wrestled God and won. And so he didn't. He says, "Yeah, you may have won, but now you're a crip for the rest of your life."
so remember that, yeah.
So yes, God uses suffering to bring us around. Sometimes He certainly does, and there's no doubt about it. Sometimes we need that to get our heads on straight. And it's sad to say that it is like that, but yeah, sometimes that happens.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and I wanted to say thank you too for the.
All right. No problem. Thank you. Goodwin, you had you were going to say something.
Maybe I shouldn't, but yeah.
Go ahead. Well, tell you what,
You
you want me to
mentioned
go ahead? You
earlier-
want me to go ahead and cut off all of the recordings before you say something?
If you think it's easier for the rest of me, yeah.
Oh
If
no,
not,
go ahead.
No,
go
that's
ahead.
fine. But you mentioned something earlier about rich not cutting in line, and whatever. I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't remember everything, but and this goes back to something I was always wondering, or when you showed the house of the rich Greek or whatever. But I mean, there's the eye of the needle comment that Yeshua made about the rich guy who, when he wanted to follow him, he said, "What can I do to whatever?" And
to be saved.
he says, "Well, leave your family and everything." But I mean, doesn't it basically condemn those who you just said should, let the poor people get in line? I don't know if I'm saying that. But I always struggle with that thought.
Okay. No. Well.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeshua said the guy asked him, "What can I do to be saved?" And he says, "For you," he says, "Go and sell whatever you had and follow me."
Right.
And he said, and he couldn't do it because why? Because that's what he put his faith and trust in, his wealth, and it wasn't in Yeshua. Okay. Other people, Nicodemus was one, Joseph of Arimathea, another, very wealthy people. Dorcas in Paul's travel, in the book of Acts, a wealthy woman and very wealthy. She financed much of Paul's missionary journeys. So it's not that a wealthy person is condemned. It's where do they put their trust? And this particular guy that was talking to Yeshua couldn't get beyond his own wealth because that's what he trusted in and not in Yeshua. And that was the tragedy of it. And okay, good.
So no, I could you started answering. I took, in all of this time, I took that as more of a general statement, if you're rich, forget it. But now, as soon as you start answering, it's like you were talking about that specific instance, that specific person. That helps.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And that's where, when Yeshua said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get to heaven. And that's why he was saying that. It's not that a rich man can't be saved. It's just that so many rich people, they depend entirely on their wealth to save them. That no matter what their problem is, they don't have to ask the Lord because they'll just go down to the bank and write a check. And so that's that's where their faith and their trust is, and it's not in God and not in Yeshua. And that's why he said, and that idea, you know, and I've heard people strange, just okay, Rabbi Trail here, the eye of a needle. What was Yeshua talking about? He was talking about the eye of a needle. He was not talking about some foolishness about this little door in the wall of the town where a camel would, you'd have to take all the burdens off the camel and he could have to crawl through this little door. Baloney. No, what he's talking about was what he said, the eye of a needle. So Yeshua used the hyperbola of the day to make a point. And that's what he said. It's easier to get through that eye of the needle than it is for a rich man to give up his wealth. And, you know, in so many cases, that's the case, that rich people don't put their faith in God. They put their faith in themselves and in their bank account.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That really helped. As I said, I saw the general statement, but thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, any other comments or questions? I'm gonna say Lila told we'll cut the recording off, and then you can ask your questions too. But Lila told we'll see you this next weekend, and I'm going to stop the live streaming now.